Hi, my name is Boris, and in this video I'm going to show you the top 5 music production mistakes. I've been guilty of some of these in the past, and I wanted to share the most common mistakes, why they happen and how to avoid them, so that you can improve your productions. Before we get into the video, if you like what we are doing on this channel, make sure to subscribe. And if you'd like to learn Ableton Live 12 with all the foundations of music production, check out our Beginner to Advanced Live 12 Start to Finish course. Alright, so let's just jump into it. Mistake or problem number 1 is getting stuck in a loop. So we have a loop. We have a loop from one of our templates called Ignite, and let's hear it.
Embrace the binary flow and let your circuits ignite.
It's a really great loop, but once you've made it, you can feel very stuck. You can feel scared to start arranging the track because you don't want to fail with doing it. There's an absolutely overwhelming choice of things you could do. So do you start with the kick? Do you start with the bass? Do you start with the vocals? Absolutely, you could arrange a track in an infinite number of ways. And at the same time, you might not know what you should be doing. So you might not know the blueprint for arrangement in your genre, and you might feel a bit lost there. At the same time, you might be a bit tired already. Making a loop sound good is already a bit of work in itself, and you feel like you've already used up your best idea. How the hell are you going to make the rest of the track to sound as good as this loop? And when making the loop, you need to be very detail oriented, and when arranging, you need to think about the entire track. So you sort of need to zoom out of the fine details of the synth and take a look at how this impacts the entire arrangement. It's kind of difficult to shift the attention towards the track as a whole. So to combat this problem, I've got the great technique which comes from James Wiltshire, and here's the solution. First of all, see if you can make a B section. Take your loop, copy it, and make some big change. For instance, you could make a loop like this. So what's added here is, of course, the melody on top. And what you need to do right now is close your program, step away from the computer, and go listen to some music. Listen to some tracks in your genre, take a blank piece of paper and draw the excitement level and the arrangement any way you like. You can scribble, map out where the intro starts and ends, whether there's a bridge, how many repeats there are, what kind of tricks are used. Listen to a few tracks and map out the arrangement exactly the way you want. And this works so well with the piece of paper instead of the DAW because you're not focusing on the technicalities of the DAW, which can be very tedious. And you just want to free up your creativity. You can do anything you like on the piece of paper. Okay, so once you have a few arrangements mapped out like this, take another blank piece of paper and do the same thing for your track. For example, you could say, okay, so I have this A and B section, these could be fitted here and there, and I need this and this and this section in order to have the track complete. And I could, for example, use this trick that was used in this track before the drop. Now go back to your track, take your A and B section and spread out the elements accordingly to what you've written on your piece of paper. And the last thing you need to do is just fill in the gaps, and that's what humans are good at. It's overwhelming when you don't have a blueprint, but once you've created it, it's already just a set of tasks you can do. So I need a new bass line in this section, or I need to change up the hi-hats pattern in this section. You can do that. It's more overwhelming when you don't have a set of goals like this. So this also works very well because you're not listening to your loop over and over and over and tiring your ears even more. You are kind of refreshing your hearing by listening to some other songs. And this can be very inspiring at the same time. And this is overall for me a much more pleasant experience rather than trying to figure it out in the DAW from the very start. Okay, so mistake number 2 is too much focus on sound design. Now here's the problem. If you want to make a full track, you need to create a lot of elements, and you need to do that before you get tired of the track completely. And very often, instead of focusing on the track as a whole, you end up hyper-focusing on a single element and trying to make it sound as good as possible. And that leads to wasting time and ultimately to being frustrated. Even though you designed a beautiful bass, you're still far behind with creating the full track. And this happens because plugins and DAW have endless options of customization. You could spend the entire day in C Room and then another day just messing around with the audio effects on top of one single track. Ableton has so many options. That wasn't possible back in the day when you had to record something to tape, and then it was pretty much unchangeable. This mistake also happens because you might really like the element you're working on. You might prefer to work on it further to improve it, rather than kind of forcing yourself to make new elements. And to some producers it's also much easier to focus on the sound design instead of the composition and arrangement. And here's the solution. You need to shift your attention from the individual elements to the track as a whole. You need to ask yourself the question, does what you're making make the track better, or are you losing your energy on tweaking things, let's be honest, that nobody will ever notice? You need to also acknowledge that unless you're in a sound design heavy genre, most people will not pay that much attention to the sound design. Focus on what your audience cares about, which in a lot of cases is catchy harmony and groovy rhythm. Another approach is, rather than designing everything from scratch, try to pick at samples and presets that sound really good from the start. It's much easier to start from a solid foundation rather than polishing the wrong sound. You can also have your favorites saved up for easier access. For example, you don't really need to change the kick drum for every single track. If you're in a rock band, you play the same guitar over many songs and no one cares about that. And you also don't need to change absolutely everything every time you make a new track. You need to also accept that your track won't be perfectly mixed from the very start, and that you will know a good idea from a bad one without a lot of mixing in the early stages of production. If you're working in the same genre over and over, you could also make a starting template for yourself with some of the basic elements you use every time to speed up the early stages of production. Okay, mistake number 3, tempo adjustments. So here's the problem. You might, for example, set your tempo at the beginning of your writing process. 128 BPM, common tempo for house music. Then you write your patterns according to that tempo. We have this loop here, let's play it. Once you've fully written out your MIDI, for instance we have this pattern right here, your ear has already kind of gotten used to the tempo, meaning that it won't be your first instinct to tweak it. But the track might really benefit from doing so. So the solution is basically to remind yourself of checking the tempo. Refresh your ears, take a break, listen to some other tracks in your genre, then when you come back, check if the tempo can be adjusted. For instance, this might work much better at 125. Subtle changes, a few BPM like this, can make or break a track sometimes. Mistake number 4 is all about stereo. So here's the problem. You might not be aware of the necessity to consider the stereo spectrum of your sounds at all. Or you might not fully understand how to manage your stereo spectrum when mixing your track. There's also a lot of myths floating around the internet about the stereo spectrum. As a result, your track might sound too narrow or too wide, or too all over the place, or it might collapse when played on a mono system. So here's the solution. Stereo field adjustment is a must for every mix. You need to think through the arrangement. Which elements do you want to stand out and which you want to serve as the background? A good rule of thumb is keeping the essentials, like the leads, kick drum and bass, more mono than stereo, especially the kick drum and bass very often is completely mono, and background elements like cymbals, percussion and pads might be panned or spread out in the stereo spectrum. Any sound pretty much can still sound very strong in mono, even though it's stereo. What happens when you go too crazy with making your sound stereo is that it might collapse in mono, meaning that it will get phasey and some elements will drastically lose their volume. But a sound can be still interesting stereo-wise and still sound good when summed up to mono. That's where special tools come in, like the Wider plugin or Ozone Imager, where you can stereoize the sound and still make sure that the sound sounds good in mono. You need to also know how to narrow your sound, so for example you might use mid-side EQing for that, or you could use a width knob like an utility, or if you want to enhance the stereo image of any track, you might use the chorus on some elements. Reverb is also a great way of enhancing the stereo image, or you could use the haze effect just like in the Ozone Imager here. You also can use some monitoring tools to visualize the stereo image of your track and to check the phase. Flux Stereo tool is a great plugin to visualize the track, or you could also use the built-in Ozone Imager visualizer here. So this is what the track as a whole sounds like. Let's put it on the piano. Let's see what the piano looks like. So you can see that the piano is much more stereo, but still we're keeping it fairly mono. And mistake number 5 is overproducing. So we have this track right here, let's hear it. But if you zoom into this group number 6, you can see that this loop is comprised of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tracks, and it sounds like this. And you probably didn't even notice this loop in the background. It's a very, very subtle effect. Now, doing heavy layering like this is okay towards the end of the production process, but the problem is when you start overproducing from the very start. Now, here's what happens when you're overproducing. You might constantly feel that you need to improve something. When you have the arrangement, for instance, here we have the entire track mapped out, it's much easier to add things or tweak things instead of change, for example, the harmony, to rearrange the track. As a result, you stack effects on top of effects, you stack layers on top of layers, and you infinitely tweak your synth patches. The same applies to your master chain. It's a very common mistake to use too many effects on the master because you feel like you need to improve something. As a result, the track loses dynamics and just sounds way over-processed. The issue could be instead, if you don't like the track, that you've listened to it for too long, your ears are already tired of it, or that you're producing without a strong core idea. If you've gotten bored of the composition, you might get fixated on some element and try to improve it further and further, just overproducing it. Or if you have no strong core idea, no matter how well you produce the track, it's still going to sound boring and no one will care about the track. Now here's the solution. You need to know what's most important in your genre or your style and focus on these elements. It could be the catchy harmony, it could be the amazing drumming, it could be the outstanding sound design even, or just the awesome vibe of your track. But when listening to your track, it should be clear what the hook is. I think you should go into making a track with a certain approach, which is suitable for the genre you're trying to make. Otherwise, you're going to end up stacking tracks on top of tracks and overproducing a weak idea. You can also try working with a few tracks only. If you take a look at this track right here, even though we have some drumming layers here, it's a very simple idea. We have basic elements, piano, bass, and the basic drums, and very dense cymbals and percussion. In this case, the bass, the piano, and the hi-hats are what makes the track great. So it probably wouldn't be beneficial to spend 2 days on the kick drum itself. Great tracks are also very often made of very few elements. There might not be a lot of layers at all. The brain can focus on very few elements at once. So make sure you have a great hook in your track and don't flood your arrangement with unnecessary tracks. A good rule of thumb is trying to disable various elements, and if you don't miss it, then keep it. And if you have issues in your track, try to start by fixing them in the mix before you start trying to fix them on the master. And starting with basic changes like volume and EQ. I feel like this solves half of the problems. And on the master, don't go crazy, use small adjustments, slight EQ, compression limiting, especially if you don't know what you're doing 100% and how you're affecting the sound. Alright, I hope you will find any of these tips useful. Let us know in the comments what mistakes you think other producers should avoid, and let's learn from each other's experience. Make sure to check out our Music Production Academy with start to finish courses on making tracks in various genres, as well as the Beginner to Advanced Live 12 Start to Finish course, which teaches you all the foundations of music production. All links you'll find in the video description. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and I will see you in the next ones.